So just for the final session of the day now, I'm going to, the keynote closing address, going to introduce Mark Maio. Now, any of you who have looked in detail at the programme for today's speakers will have seen a précis of Mark's work-life history. And although it's a summary, it's actually a massive resume reflecting a very impressive career. I think it points to a man with a passion for pushing forwards the boundaries both of photography and of technology. And yet alongside this, Mark seems to have managed to achieve something which I know I found hard, and that is continuing a passion for photography outside work, which I think is a fantastic thing. And if you take the time to look at Mark's website, you'll see some fantastic photographs, stunning images, which I know I'd be really proud to have my name against if they were mine. Sadly, they're not. So we're very lucky to have Mark with us here today. I'm not going to read through the summary of his career and his work. I'll leave you to do that because it'll take up too much time, I think. So we're lucky to have Mark here. He spends his time between Atlanta in Georgia and the Isle of Skye, and currently on his way to Skye. He's dropped into the studio here in Glasgow today at Kathy's department. And he's going to give us his presentation, which is called Sliding Doors, an intersection between medicine and art. So Mark, over to you.
Well, I want to thank the organization for inviting me, and we have this being able to actually be here at the Royal Infirmary to actually present on our way. We just came into Scotland a couple of days ago. When Kathy asked me to do this talk, we tried to come up with what I was going to talk about. We weren't going to be making something really technical about photography, but it was really about my career and my life in my photography, both on the medical, scientific, technical side and the fine art side. And so, you know, the disclaimer here is that I'm apologizing because it's going to be all about me. But what I really want to do is offer some way to look at all of our careers, what we do with our life, with our passion, and see how we can take that and mix it and you know, to me, being successful isn't about making money. It's about doing the types of things that you want to do. And so, looking at the title of this talk, came up with Sliding Doors, an old, maybe one of the original Gwyneth Paltrow movies. That's really two movies in one. She's working in London, and she decides to go home early from work, and as she leaves the office, the doors on the lift close, and she misses them, and she's trying to get out of the building, and the doors close, and she gets to the tube, and the doors close, and she gets home, and her boyfriend's there, and life goes on, and then it sort of rewinds, and she does the same thing, except this time she makes all the doors, gets home early, finds her boyfriend with her girlfriend, and her life changes. And so I think I use that as a metaphor in looking at my life and my career in photography to say, how do, you know, we have choices, and there are some things that we consciously choose to do, and the other things in your life that you might not have any control over. For me, 4 grandparents that immigrated from a small town in Sicily to the United States to have a better life for my parents and for their grandchildren. And I had no control over that. My father was on the second American ship, the second to last American ship, sunk in World War II, and 75% of the crew died, and he didn't, and I'm here. So, you know, I'm looking at that opportunity, what it gave me, and then what I did with it. The first thing was, you know, when I think about it in terms of photography, is that you know, sometimes there's things that we really want, or we think we want, and then life has a way of really showing us in the end what we really need. And for me, I grew up Italian Catholic, went to a private Catholic grade school in the States. That meant that there were always these programs where they'd have us go and raise money by selling candies or something. And in my case, it was again, my father, we were, blue collar a family and didn't have a lot of money, and I always wanted a bike. And so this particular time, the first prize was this brand new bicycle. And so I was determined I was going to get it. I sold candy in my neighborhood. I sold it to my relatives. I went on a busy street corner and sold it. And I just knew that I sold more boxes of candy than anybody in my school. And so we were sitting there, they were making the announcements, and they were going to announce first prize. And I'm about ready to get up, and the woman who was running the contest announces it. And just by chance, her son happened to sell one more box of candy than I did. And so he got the bike. And for me, second prize was a camera outfit. And I took that camera and I started using it and making photographs that were all black and white, until my parents, who had to pay for the processing, told me to stop. So I did, but that sort of got me started on what when I look back, it got me started on my career. And in retrospect, I look at this and say that every time something like that happened, it was really a way of redirecting me into where I really needed to be. I love to draw. So here I'm talking to many illustrators, and took art classes. I was in, high school and drawing, and I made this drawing, and I get it back from my art teacher, and he's taken a red pen and sort of outlined where he thinks my drawing should be. And then he literally, this is a 16 by 20 piece of board, and he wrote along the whole back of it basically how terrible it was, and that my grade of a C- was a gift, basically telling me that I had no talent whatsoever in drawing. Again, at the time, it's sort of, in some ways, you're mad, it devastates you, and you look at your teacher as somebody that you're really going to follow the advice for. I then started going to classes in my high school on printing, actually hand setting type, and looking to have a career in the graphic arts printing side of. And I grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. It was a very big printing city in the United States. So it was, you could become an apprentice, a journeyman. You had that skill, you were going to get a job and have a good career. And so I went to school, signed up to go to a technical college in Milwaukee for printing. But another thing sort of happened at that time. My friends and I played a lot of poker during that time. And in the United States back then, you didn't see much on TV and sports other than American baseball, basketball, and American football. But every Saturday they'd have this wide world of sports, and every year they had the National Poker Championship, and they'd have $1 million on a table. And this guy, Amarillo Slim, won that year. And I remember him being interviewed, and reporters are asking him questions and telling him, you're the greatest poker player in the world. And what he said to me was really something have remembered all my life. He says, no, I was just the best poker player here this weekend. He says, the greatest poker player in the world can be some guy that plays in his garage in Detroit with his buddies every Saturday night. He's just not here. And it was something I always remembered, in that just because we hear or see somebody being touted as the best, that doesn't mean that they're the best, or it doesn't mean that what we or someone else is doing isn't just as good. And so that was something I moved forward in my life with. The other thing was that in my printing class, my teacher told us that if we finished our assignments for the year, this is my senior year in high school, he'd teach us how to process and print film. And so I did. I got a camera, and I took my first roll of film and developed it, and I made my first prints, and it was magical. I was in that dark room, and 8 hours later, he's knocking on the door telling me I had to leave. And the magic of seeing that print just come up in the tray, was something, if you talk to photographers who started in using film and paper in photography, they'll always say, what's interesting now is that you never hear anybody say that started it with digital photography. There was that magic when the time I hit that print button and that print came off the Epson printer. I mean, it's just not, it doesn't have that feel anymore. I do digital photography that's all I do now. I'm not saying going back, but there was something about that made us sort of connected to the medium. In the States, there are a number of, every state has its own college system. There are private colleges. Every state has what are called technical colleges or community colleges. They offer 2-year degrees. And that's where I started, because that's where I was going to learn how to be a printer. And I started in printing, and I was putting myself through school, working at a steel mill at night to pay tuition. And I found myself, I hated going to my printing class, and I had a photography class that I couldn't wait to go to. And I remember talking to a fellow student who said to me, so become a photographer. And that's what I did. I changed my major, and my parents were upset because they knew I could get a much better job as a printer in Milwaukee. And like most photographers at the time, we learned photography using a 4x5 view camera. We didn't start actually getting a 35 millimeter camera to use in class until our second year. So I'd make photographs for assignments. On the photo on the left, it was an assignment of photographing a neighborhood. On the right is a photograph of I gave myself a self-assignment to photograph every Christmas morning and go out and photograph. And my wife is here with me, and she's a veterinary surgeon, so she wanted to make sure that we had both cats and dogs here to please all pet lovers. But what I was taught was how to become a photographic problem solver. I wasn't taught how to become an artist. And so we were taught how to make a living with photography, not express ourselves artistically. So some of the things we did, and this is back in 73, 74, was we started making holograms and using lasers. And I'm thinking to myself, as a typical student, why am I ever going to have to know anything about lasers and making images with lasers? Obviously now in ophthalmology, we're using scanning lasers for almost everything. But back then, you think as a student, you know it all, and you question everything that they're teaching you. So I had all these skills that I learned that I didn't think I was going to be able to use further. So we also learned how to make what's called a dye transfer print, which is taking a color slide or transparency, breaking it down into 3 black and white matrix, and using red, green, and blue filters to make these. Again, I'm thinking to myself, why do I ever need to know anything about red, green, and blue in photography? And so you make these masks and everything, and then you take that matrix and then you put it into cyan, magenta, and yellow dye, and they're all registered, and you put it together, and you end up with this print. Again, I'm thinking to myself, why do I care about cyan, magenta, and yellow? Why do I care about RGB? And of course, now in digital, that's all we're doing, is we're making exposures on sensors with RGB, and we're using cyan, yellow, magenta inks to print. But again, you don't know that 40 years ago. The American photographer Ansel Adams was just coming into his own when I was in school, and we all, or many of my fellow photographers, we all wanted to be Ansel Adams, and nobody know more than myself. I thought, Ansel Adams, AA, Mark Maio, MM, sort of have that. Even then in college, I was starting to get gray hair, so I thought I was predestined to be the next Ansel Adams. But one thing that really happened was that Ansel Adams believed in teaching and sharing the information. And he wrote these 3 books that in essence became our Bible when we were in photography school. And interestingly, if you look at these books right now and you just change things to digital in terms of the a lot of the words in them, it applies exactly the same way. But we learn this and then learn to, in a sense, be able to take our images, make a negative, and somehow be able to express that in a way that felt the way we felt when we made the image. And so that whole idea of pre-visualizing a scene and being able to see it in your mind's eye, and then being able to make that image later on in the darkroom, was really how I began my photography. We had a photo history course, and a couple of the photographers that I really gravitated towards were Eugene Smith, with his black and white work, as he'd have extended projects, bodies of work that he'd put together. Was a life photographer, photographed during the Second World War. So I gravitated towards that. And also Henry Cartier-Bresson in The Decisive Moment, using a Leica camera, one lens, and really waiting for and finding the elements that came together at that exact moment that you made the exposure that made the photograph work. We were also pushed to study painters in terms of our background in how to look at and make images. And I gravitated towards the American photographer, painter Edward Hopper, and his use of light. And I gravitated towards it. It was only until later in my look back at my photographs did I see how I really what an impression his use of that strong light made on the way I looked at and made photographs. The other painter, and the other American painter, was Charles Sheeler, who was not just a painter but a photographer. And so again, his sort of photorealistic paintings, but of industrial scenes, were something. Milwaukee, Wisconsin was a very industrial part of America. That's where I grew up, and that's visually I was attracted to that. But he was a photographer, and again, he photographed industrial scenes. He photographed the Ford plant in Detroit, and ironically, he photographed along the Buffalo River in Buffalo, New York, the grain elevators, and that image and his work there will come into play later in my life. But I love it when this saying about how amazing how photography has advanced without really improving, because ultimately, whether we're using some complicated camera or our smartphone, it's still a photograph. We didn't have a color TV in our house until I was probably a senior in high school. So everything was in black and white. And of course, most of the movies in the 40s and 50s were done in black and white. And if you look at them, you see again how they used lighting to really create moods rather than animations and special techniques that they use now in chase scenes. So when I look back, I see how much that played a role in how I saw the world. But what really happened was it taught me how to see in black and white. Back then we had a little filter that we'd have it hanging around our neck, and when you held it up, it gave you this look in this photograph. And so you could take the color out of a scene and start looking at how it broke down into shades of black to white, and then be able to make exposures or pre-visualize that image before you made the exposure, and how you would develop it. And then you go from there to that. And that's really how I was taught to see. Even now, everything I look at, even though it's in color, I really look at it as a black and white photograph. Doesn't mean I don't make color photographs, it just means that I do that instinctively. And back then, these are some assignments that I made back when I was in college the first time, using a 4x5 view camera, exploring the city I lived in. As I went through school, I found out what I knew the types of photography I didn't want to do. I didn't want to be a portrait photographer, wedding photographer, commercial, advertising. I really had this desire, I thought, to be like Eugene Smith. I wanted to be a documentary photographer. I wanted to use my photographs somehow to tell a story and help change some change the world with my images. And as I was going into school and studying photography, all of a sudden Life magazine folded. And what happened was, I also noticed that we were seeing video via satellite. The Vietnam War was going on, and we were watching things happening as they were happening, or at least during that day. And somehow instinctively, I knew that the side of news that we were going to use wasn't going to be still photographers spending 30 days working on an assignment. It was going to go towards video. So I really had to find something else to do. Fortunately, the college I went to, I had an English research paper class, and it was all photographers, and they required us to do research, a part of photography that you didn't know anything about. And for me, I saw this thing called medical photography, and I said, gee, this is some way that I could use photography in a way to help people, much like I wanted to do with my documentary photography. So that's what I did. Is I didn't have formal training in medical photography, but I found a job as a medical photographer. And even the job I got, I was actually going to be hired to work in a children's hospital. And then that got put on hold. And in the meantime, another opening came at a hospital for one of the medical colleges. And I got that job again, which took me on a completely different path. And we did things, did photomicrography. These were all on film, and these images actually had to be put together in a metal jig, and those letters had to be put on there, and the little rulers had to be, and then another photograph had to be made of them for the pathology department to do in teaching. And it was laborious work. This is something we could do now in a minute in PowerPoint or Keynote. But what it did do, though, is it started me looking at, I'm making these images. How can I also make them artistic? How can I sort of express some of myself? I do what was required of me, but I'd also push it. And I did that for a few years. And the head medical illustrator told me about a person who had gone to the same college I had worked there, but he was doing this thing called ophthalmic photography. I had no idea what that was. So I made an appointment. I went and saw him, and a few months later there was an opening, and I got the job. And I had no idea what ophthalmic photographers really did. And I knew nothing about ophthalmology. I thought if you couldn't see well, you just got new glasses. And that took me on this path. And I said to myself, what better way for a photographer to help people than to help them with their vision? And that's really been the course of my life on that end ever since, is that whatever we do, whether it's actually doing diagnostic photography or in the role of teaching other people how to do this, is that we're just all there to help people and save their sight, whatever it is that we can. And so I did that in Milwaukee at the Medical College of Wisconsin for 3 years, and then got recruited to run the ophthalmic photography department at Emory University in Atlanta. That then grew from the department being me to the department being 6 people. And we did the whole spectrum of photography, dark rooms and printing and clinical trials and research. We had animal lab with an ophthalmic photography department there. Excuse me. At the same time, though, it was the time that I realized that when people would ask me what I did, I started explaining that there were sort of 2 halves of my life, photographic life. One was the science, medical side of it, and the other was the art. And then I combined those two. And at times they fed one another. Sometimes I do more of the ophthalmic science side, and then sometimes I do more of the personal side, but I never let go of that side of my photography. And those of you on the call here that do ophthalmic photography know that we have different parts of the eye. We have different photographic diagnostic imaging techniques we use for those different parts. I had to learn that. I had to learn the anatomy, physiology of the eye. I had to sit in lectures with the doctors and run those lectures, but learn that. Back then we would do color photographs of the retina, and then we'd inject sodium fluorescein dye and do fluorescein angiograms, and that would be done to diagnose, and laser treatment would be based on that. And then there would be injections given based on the fluorescein angiogram. And now we've moved to where so much of it is being done by scanning laser, that laser word coming into play. But at the time, I also started looking at my ophthalmic photography and saying, how can I make images after I did the diagnostic images I needed that were more artistic? And so I really concentrated on that as a way of expressing myself, because there was a period of time there I didn't have a dark room, so I couldn't develop and print my own film. And so I was just using transparency film, making color images, which were okay, but I really wanted black and white. But I would do all these images, again, looking at them in an artistic way. Some of these images were then purchased. This image happened to be an image that Merck Pharmaceutical did a poster of and handed out at the big American Academy of Ophthalmology one year. I then, when I learned ophthalmic photography is really through an organization like IMI, but it was the Ophthalmic Photographers Society. And there were the people who started this organization in 1969, provided educational courses, and I would never have had the career I had it not been for the programs that they put on, the time and effort that they put into volunteering to run the organization, much like your officers, the people that run IMI do. It's you don't know how much time and effort goes into it until you actually volunteer and start doing some of this. I did that in a way after I established myself to give back, being on boards of certification, education, boards of directors. I became the president for two terms, but even being the newsletter editor and working with the journal and running meetings, I did that to give back to the organization. I never knew by doing that how much I was learning that I was going to use later on in my life, in my career in photography. My wife and I did a lot of traveling through the U.S. and we'd photograph. And a lot of it was color back then, again, because I didn't have the use of a dark room, but I had to photograph. And so I would do a lot of color photography as we traveled. And again, I wanted to be Ansel Adams, and Ansel Adams had a workshop that he offered every year that I wanted to go to. And I always said, someday I'm going to go to the Ansel Adams workshop. And someday came that Ansel Adams died, and I couldn't go to the Ansel Adams workshop to see him. But I signed up for the last one that they had because they had already scheduled it, and it changed my life. I thought it was going to be all about technical aspects of films, cameras, printing, and it was none of that. It was all about teaching us how to find our own voice and vision in our art and how to express that. And this image here, I had a review of my portfolio done in Ansel Adams' living room one evening, and the two people doing it said, we're going to go up to the high Sierras tomorrow, and what I want you to do is find something you want to photograph, put your camera down, sit there, look at it, walk around it, and let it tell you how to photograph it. And I did that, and I made this image. What I should have done was made the first image I would have made to be able to show it, but it changed my life photographically and how I saw and how I photographed. The other thing was that this book came out on Steve Jobs as he was starting Apple. And the title of it is "The Journey is a Reward" really resonated with me, because it wasn't about, in a sense, finding something at the end of the road. It was about the whole journey and the way to get there. And sometimes that, most of the time, that journey isn't from point A to point B. And sometimes if you go just from point A to point B, you cut yourself off from other options that you might try. The other thing that really resonated with me was, I love Miles Davis. I love his work, but this quote of his that, sometimes you have to play a long time to start playing like yourself. And I think that holds true, so true in photography. There's the 10,000 hour concept of whatever it is you do, and there's the 10,000 negative concept. And it's like, I think Henry Cartier-Bresson said, your first 10,000 negatives are terrible. They're just trash. And it takes you that long before you start actually knowing what you're doing and knowing what you're saying. And that I started to see that, and I saw how it started to change my photography. And then there's the don't be afraid of change. As we've seen in our lives, it's continually changing. And here Ansel Adams in 1982, when he was 80 years old, 2 years before he died, if you see, I'm sure the next stop will be the electronic image, and I hope I shall live to see it. I mean, even he, before we even started doing electronic imaging, we did it in space, but looked at it with his work. And you would know that if he was alive when digital took over, he'd be on the forefront of doing it. The other thing I learned was that my best teacher is my last mistake. I'm always making. I made all the mistakes you could ever make. I invented new mistakes. When I go and photograph, people will say to me, "Oh, how many images did you make that were good?" And I mean, I'd say 99.9% of the time I fail in my images. There's just like 1/10 of 1% of my images at the end of me photographing actually are images that I believe work, that I'm going to show somebody. It's not that they're not technically good. It's just that I'm constantly looking to make my images work better. So I had a 2-year associate degree in photography, and I worked at Emory, and I got recruited to come up to the State University of New York, the medical school at the State University of New York, as a clinical assistant professor of ophthalmology, a rank that's normally only given to physicians. And so I had to go through this process of being given this rank. But I went up there to not only run the ophthalmic photography department, but I always wanted to establish a Bachelor of Science degree program in ophthalmic photography. And I was able to do that there. We would always have people coming into our, when I was working at Emory, saying, "Oh, how did you learn how to do this?" And, you didn't want to say, "Well, I didn't really learn other than on the job," but you did. And so I established this Bachelor of Science degree program. I also became an assistant professor at the Rochester Institute of Technology, which we had the only biomedical photography program in the US. And I introduced ophthalmic photography to that program. And it came to the point where I actually started teaching ophthalmic photography in that program over in Buffalo, which is only 60 miles away. And now a lot of the students at RIT in biomedical photography come out of that program as ophthalmic photographers. I decided to go back to school to get my Bachelor of Science degree. I wanted to get in biomedical photography, and there was a way for me to do that through the State University of New York. And I was able to put together my own degree. And I had this interest, obviously being Italian and being in it from a northern industrial city, and that's the same thing as Buffalo. I was visually interested in ethnic neighborhoods. And so they assigned me as a professor who had written some books about Buffalo. And it was a 16-week course. And he said, "I want you to take your camera and explore a neighborhood." And he drove me around Buffalo, and he let me pick a neighborhood. And that 16-week course lasted 16 years. I explored it using just a basic camera, like a camera, didn't even have a light meter in it. Always used Ilford film. I had a couple of rolls of film in my camera, and I started exploring this what turned out to be, it was an Irish neighborhood along the Erie Canal and the Buffalo River. And this is the view that you get when you come down into that area. These were the descendants of the guys that immigrated from Ireland and that were hired to hand dig the Erie Canal across New York State. They settled at the terminus of the canal. Many of them were from the prisons in New York because they couldn't pay anybody. The work was so terrible. So they gave these Irish prisoners, you can work on the canal and then your sentence is commuted. And then at the end, they were the low-class labor that was then doing the manual labor of unloading the boats coming across the Great Lakes and the barges. on the canal. And, I started in this neighborhood, and this sort of exemplifies the presence of the grain elevators, which were invented in Buffalo, the Erie Canal, and what it played in a role. All the guys that worked on the harbor were from this neighborhood. This is sort of a, in the US, we have TSA, which is our Transportation Security Administration, coming into the country. Back in the First World War, there was actually, all these guys had to have these cards to be able to allow them to get onto the harbor to work, because the US government was afraid that someone would come in and sabotage it. This was the sort of the lifeline to send food over to Europe during the First World War. But these are just images here of this neighborhood. And I started walking around, I started meeting people, I started photographing, learning about the neighborhood. I didn't do any research on it other than with my camera and the people that I met. And the more I photographed, the more I knew that there was more to this than just photographs, that there really was some writing that had to go along with it. There was a history here. And so I then found that there were these guys from the neighborhood, 80 of them, that were called grain scoopers, and they were unloading the grain boats using technology from the 1840s to do it. So these are ropes and pulleys, and there's big shovels, and they pull the grain to one end of the hold, and it gets elevated up. And there were 4 groups of 20. In 1900, there were 3,000 of these guys. And I just knew instinctively that I had been chosen to tell this story because it wasn't going to last forever. And so I became the only person who was allowed to go down into the holds of the boat with these guys and photograph them. And a boat would come in, I'd go down to photograph early in the morning, and then go to my office at the hospital, change, work as an ophthalmic photographer, and then I go back in the evening and photograph some more. And I did this over a period of a number of years with one of those groups of 20 guys. Every time they came, the boat would come in, I would be there helping them or photographing with them in the boat, having drinks with them afterwards. I then started to ask the question, where does this grain come from? And I found out that it came from Duluth, Minnesota, which is at the end of the Great Lakes. And so I did a part of this project was I made arrangements to meet one of the boats in Duluth, Minnesota, and I did a round trip sailing on it and photographing the loading and unloading process and the whole process of it going over. And I also said, where does it come from to Duluth? And that was in a lot of it came from Kansas. And one of my students had a cousin who had a wheat farm in Kansas. So 2 summers, I spent 2 summers living with that for a short period of time, living with that family and photographing the entire process of cutting wheat and moving wheat in a small town in Kansas. The gentleman on the right, excuse me, was the man I stayed with, his family, and would again just shadow him, essentially going everywhere he did during the day, photographing the small towns, the small elevators, the large terminal elevators as the wheat was being moved from there to the elevator. Then by train, it would move to the Mississippi River, and then go down barges for the most part. This is the boat that I caught in Duluth, Minnesota, that I took the trip across the Great Lakes with. But I also found and followed the grain down to New Orleans on the barges, because that was the new place that grain was being transshipped from. In 1959, the US and Canadian government got together and enlarged the St. Lawrence Seaway. So ocean-going ships from anywhere in the world could come up into the Great Lakes, fill up with grain, and go anywhere in the world. And that essentially cut any grain coming into Buffalo to only the grain that was being used in Buffalo. And overnight, that whole industry died. Like I said, the project with the grain scoopers doing this finally ended 16 years later, when they, instead of having these boats that they had to unload, they came with self-unloading grain boats. And so that essentially killed the industry in Buffalo. The work put together. It's been shown in some galleries around the country. But in 2012, the George Eastman House International Museum of Photography purchased a 12 print portfolio for their permanent collection. And, it was, it's great that happening. But for me, the irony was that when I was that 18-year-old kid back in school, we learned the history of photography by the book that was done by the executive director of the George Eastman House. And I never in my wildest dreams thought, as I was looking at all this work from all these photographers, that my work would ever be included in the same place as theirs. That this work now in 2 years is going to be an exhibition that's going to open at the Birchfield Penny Art Center in Buffalo. There's going to be a book that goes along with it. Those will tour different museums in the United States. And there's also our public TV stations. There's one in the Buffalo, Toronto, Canada area, and they're going to be doing a 30-minute presentation, PBS presentation on the project that also goes. So that is what I'm, working to try to get done now. But getting back also to learning and always being ready to change. When digital started in ophthalmology, probably in 1984, 85, the resolution and quality was so low that I was the person in all the meetings raising my hand and saying, something, I'm not going to do this diagnostic test. If I wouldn't do it on my parents, I wouldn't do it on a patient. Film is still better. And if I had it done on me, I'd want a film angiogram done. So I'd always be the one taught, it's faster, it's quicker. But back then the resolution was 512K by 512K. Of course, you never say never. Digital started getting more and more popular. And through one of my students that I taught ophthalmic photography to, he actually then went into the commercial digital photography world, where there were very expensive high resolution or higher resolution cameras, but they weren't something that we could use really in ophthalmology. And but I kept abreast of what was happening. And then he told me about this full-size 35mm sensor that Philips had developed, 6 megapixels. And so I put together a business plan and went to a major photo show in Atlanta to all the companies, giving them my idea of how I wanted to convert this to retinal cameras. And only one company understood what I was talking about. It was a US company called Megavision. He stayed late, shipped in a bunch of equipment to my house, and in my garage, we put together, I had a Zeiss fundus camera, and we put together and did the proof of concept that we could actually take a full frame 35mm digital image on this. And that spawned the idea where we partnered, and I started a company where in 1999, we were offering high resolution, full frame, color censored and black and white sensors. I mean, I was hoping that we could get close to the quality of film. The reality was it was better than the quality of film. So this is the first company I started. This was a system we had. I wanted to create a system that you didn't have to modify the fundus camera, that went on and off like a 35mm camera did. It functioned the same way. You could get it in a color version, a black and white version, or a color version that also did black and white. Although the company I partnered with, I had a falling out with I was president of my company, but I had a falling out with the CEO, who didn't understand that we're really a software company and we needed to develop the software, not just the hardware. And when I realized that he didn't get that, I had to leave. He had to get rid of me. And so after what I built, I had nothing. I didn't have the company. I didn't have a job. I was going to put a notice on the Ophthalmic Photographer Society listserv, letting everybody know I was gone. I waited for my lawyer to put it together. And I came home from a meeting that my wife had down in Florida, and on Monday night, and Tuesday morning, I got up and made coffee and turned the TV on, and this is what I watched. And all of a sudden, my idea of my problems were totally turned upside down. And after a few weeks, I was actually able to make the announcement, and I had an offer, and I took the technology. We built the business, and that in the US was the tipping point of turning everybody onto and using digital imaging. I continued to do the work, my own personal work during all this. I've done some projects. They're all self-directed. This project is, when my wife and I first moved to in Atlanta, we noticed, my wife grew up in Atlanta. Atlanta, when I moved there in 1980, had 1.25 million people. Now it's got 7 million people, and it just keeps on getting bigger and bigger. And I looked at this sort of destruction of the old South to building the new South as the Mall of Georgia, MAUL. There's a big shopping mall in Atlanta called the Mall of Georgia, but that's what I really saw happening. And I did some other projects looking at the changing South and how that history is being lost in terms of everybody coming in, building subdivisions, shopping centers. I've doing a project. People don't realize that cotton is still the #1 crop in the state of Georgia. And so this is a project I've been doing on a small cotton gin, family-owned cotton gin with a small farm still growing cotton on the northern part of Georgia, where most of it's done in the South. I did a project in Kentucky on family-owned tobacco farms. Again, I looked at what I did in Buffalo, and I looked at smoking and figured that at some point, the family-owned tobacco farm, because it's so hand labor intensive, it's not done by machines, it's gonna disappear. So I spent some time with the family, with their farm, and this is just an image of some tobacco farmers after they auctioned off their tobacco, waiting for their check. I do images just wherever we travel, whatever we do. We love driving the back roads of anywhere. And so just making images. I got a 3-month artist residency in Charlotte, North Carolina. And this was, what I did was I spent 3 months with the level 1 trauma service at this hospital. So it's the helicopters, airplanes, it's the level 1 trauma. And I flew with them and photographed and just shadowed them and did a documentary project of that. I was also chosen in 2007, Adobe came out with a version of Photoshop they planned on called Extended, which they came out with. Extended had medical, scientific, and technical imaging tools in it. And so they found 12 of us to put together this biomedical imaging advisory council, where we worked with them on the tools that were put into Photoshop to do things like measurements. Now they've stopped having 2 versions. When you get Photoshop, you get these same tools in it. I was always fascinated with the NGO Orbis, which is the Flying Eye Hospital, started in 1980. And I always wanted to do work with them. I wanted to do work doing documentary imaging. The Flying Eye Hospital is actually a ophthalmic exam area, surgical area, recovery area. It has a lecture, a theater in it, and it's a skills transfer where volunteers from all over the world come and go to a country, and the country asks for different things that they need, they would like to get more skills at. And this plane flies in and they spend a couple of weeks there. It used to be only the plane. Well, now they've set up partner hospitals all over the world. But I've done trips to, the first one was to Nigeria, which again, for me, looking at, I went there to do documentary work, but I also went there to teach ophthalmic photography. And, just looking at the differences in how, making glasses by hand, and teaching, there was a pediatric ophthalmologist there that they wanted, and just looking at the differences in how medicine is practiced around the world, but still having that documentary sense of telling that story. By doing these, I've gone to Africa, I've gone to South America, Malaysia, Peru, but also this one is from the Philippines. This was a hemp worker. I've always had time then on these trips to go and do my own personal work. Also, then once I got on the commercial side, I've stayed on the commercial side. So I was working with a project of taking an iPhone and making it handheld retinal camera. And so we were doing this with, as a proof of concept, went down to Africa again, to Ghana, and this ophthalmologist was very involved and actually found that children have malaria. The symptoms show up in their retina. And so they were looking at a way, because most of the doctors in Africa don't know how to use an indirect ophthalmoscope to really look at the retina. And so how can we make something easier that we could put out everywhere, that people could just go, and if these kids came in and they didn't know what was going on, they could look at the retina and then send the image to somebody like her to be able to evaluate it. Out of that came, I invented a project here that uses an iPhone that's connected to a slit lamp to do slit lamp still images and video images. Again, I'm still working in that. I do consulting in that still to this day, and for various companies. Well, then lo and behold, in 2008, my wife and I decided we wanted to take a trip, and with her last name being McClellan, and she wanted to go someplace that had the waves, ocean, wind, and rocky coast. And so we chose Scotland. And when we travel, we never really make a plan of where we're going to go. We spent 4 weeks sort of traveling around Scotland, and we saw this thing called Isle of Skye on the map, and we decided to go there. And we were staying up at the north end, and as we were driving up to where we were going to stay, about a mile and a half before that, we saw this old school and schoolhouse for sale. And we stopped to look at it, and we thought, she fell in love with it and said that this is our house. But, we never had a desire to have a second house, let alone a second home in Scotland. And so it sort of was always there. Well, 7.5 years ago, she bought the house. And we live in Flottiger, just north of Stafford, and our house is the second one on the right there. And it's just been an amazing experience being here. This is an image from the first trip. When the first morning I woke up, and I got up early and went to photograph just outside the hotel we were staying at, and the clouds were coming in across from the Outer Hebrides, and the sun was moving in and out. And I remember saying to myself, if only I could live in a place like this as a photographer, it would just be amazing. And little did I know. But over the years, we've explored the island, usually come over here 3, 4, 5 weeks at a time, a couple times a year. Have done some exploring, Lewis and Harris with the Callanish stones. After a couple of years of exploring, I really got to the point where I felt I knew the island well enough to offer workshops. So I started offering workshops there. And, one of those amazing, coincidences, one day sitting at the petrol station in Fort William, waiting for the person in front of me to leave, the rain stopped, the sun came out. I looked over at, I think, the Ben Nevis distillery, and here was this Edward Hopper image in front of my eyes. And so all these things sort of come full circle as I was, again, I wouldn't have made this photograph had the person in front of me not taken so long to fill up their tank. But again, we were just back here in the summer looking at and exploring different parts of the island and the country. I mean, there's so much to see here and photograph. Again, learning and knowing learning from my mistakes and knowing which mistakes to keep, and learning which mistake I need to make again. So these are just images from sky, that I've made over the years. And again, being there and having the ability to, do work in the yard, and all of a sudden the sun comes out and you can pick up the camera, get in the car, and go and photograph is just, to me, like this blessing that I could never imagine. Again, still work mostly in black and white, although I do some color work on the island, off the island, looking at the incredible weather that comes through, the gale force winds that come, again, that I've never been exposed to before. As I said, I do workshops here where we've actually got a workshop. We do it once a year. It's only limited to 3 people, and on Sky. So that'll be going on in October. I did have I was also had the opportunity to spend 4 days on St. Kilda and to be able to photograph. And so that was just an amazing experience, being out there at the edge of the earth, so to speak, and being able to photograph all the structures and the World Heritage Site. I've gone back to Buffalo, and I just ended 10 years of doing workshops there in the grain elevators in Buffalo this past summer. So again, looking at that and going, sort of adding to the work that I did of the guys that used to be working there. And in the end, I mean, it's I have a website that has many of these images on, like I'm sure most of you do, so you can go to it. I'll have the URL here at the end, but I really get this really resonates with me. I've said since I've probably been 20 that if I live to be 100, I'll never be as good with my photography as I'd want to be, as I hoped I could be, and that I'm always going to be learning and doing new things and being able to see different ways. I'm sitting here looking at the video camera right now on a tripod, and there's another version of this talk that I have that I show sort of at this spot. I show a picture of a tripod, and I say that the only piece of equipment or technology that I'm using right now that is still basically the same as when I went back to school is a tripod. Everything else has changed. I also forgot to mention that in that project of the grain scoopers, after getting my bachelor's degree, I actually did 2 master's degrees based on that work. And a lot of that work for the master's degrees is the basis of that book I'm writing. So here's my contact information. And I guess that there's a few minutes if somebody has any questions. I don't know if I can hear them, because I couldn't hear, Nick, I couldn't hear you when you were talking. So I don't know if I could hear questions.